Well, now, in the time left this week, I want to take a look at one more ancient riverine civilization. Again, there's an awful lot to choose from, but one that makes a good counterpoint and a good balance to ancient Sumer is ancient Egypt over here. You know where Egypt is on the map already. I don't need to really go into all of this. You know that Egypt is in the upper northeast corner of the African continent. The modern state of Egypt, I guess up here, and down and over, roughly right there. We just finished talking about ancient Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is over here, and you remember we talked about ancient Sumer, which develops down here in the southern part of Mesopotamia. The modern map of Egypt is a bit misleading because it seems like it's a big nation. I mean, it's a big country in terms of territory, but in terms of population, Egypt, even today, is a very narrow, populated state. The population doesn't spread very far out from the Nile River. I didn't even bother mentioning the Nile River to you. That's the big river in Egypt. Because you've studied Egypt before, you already know the Nile River's in Egypt. Outside of, here's a more modern map, outside of people who live out in oases out in the desert, and very few people do, outside of that, then the population doesn't get very far away from the Nile River, and that's because, in the ancient world at least, of the irrigation systems that would carry the water out to where people actually lived, but you can't irrigate the whole desert. Okay. Here's a satellite image showing you where Egypt is. Egypt's up here. You see the long, narrow Nile River here, and the delta area of Egypt up here. Well, one key to understanding ancient Egypt, is that for the first about 3,000 years of its history, Egypt's a very isolated place. It's a pretty isolated place, not completely isolated, but pretty isolated, and that's largely a function of geography. Egypt, geographically, is isolated from the rest of the world. To get to Egypt from the west, you have to cross the Sahara Desert, which is quite an undertaking. To get to Egypt from the east, you have to cross the Arabian Desert, or at best, the Sinai Desert. To get to Egypt from the south, you have to cross, guess what, more desert, the Eastern Desert, it's called. And to get to Egypt from the north, you have to cross the Mediterranean Sea, a significant body of water. What that means is that very few people are going to leave Egypt and go to other places. Very few people are going to travel to Egypt from other places. Now, some will. Okay, I'm saying not a lot. That's what I'm saying, not a lot of people. And that is going to create a very different type of society in Egypt than we saw in, if I can back up here, in ancient Mesopotamia. Why won't it let me do that? There we go. Sorry about that. Been having technical problems all week with this. Okay, back on track now. When I introduced Mesopotamia to you, I told you Mesopotamia is a place of almost constant conflict and turmoil. New empires move in, old empires die out. New ideas come in, old ideas die out. Egypt, though, is going to be a very different kind of place. Egypt in the ancient world is a very stable society. Not particularly stable in the last year or two, but in the ancient world, a very stable society. And things don't change very much in Egypt. And again, that's largely a function of geography. It's a very isolated place. Egypt is only successfully invaded once in the first 3,000 years of its history. That's a long time to go with only one invasion. And, well, that's because to invade Egypt, you had to carry all the food and water for the entire military campaign, and the logistics of putting together an operation like that is, well, it only happens once in 3,000 years. And that means that things in Egypt stay pretty much the same. I can demonstrate that to you visually if we look at some traditional Egyptian artwork. If you look, for example, on page 9 in your textbook, figure 218 on page 9, you have an example of what we'll call traditional Egyptian wall painting. Here you have a pharaoh to the right, pharaoh's to the left, and the god is to the right. The god is holding the shepherd's crook, which is a symbol of leadership in the ancient Middle East. In his other hand, he's holding a fly swatter to keep away the flies. Flies had a certain negative connotation in the ancient world. Anyway, you see the pharaoh to the left and the god to the right. Well, when you get there and you see the painting here, you recognize it as Egyptian. It has an Egyptian quality about it. It looks Egyptian-y. It has that stiff, stylized presentation we associate with ancient Egypt. I mean, do you think when the pharaoh and the god bumped into each other on the street corner, the pharaoh would say, "Hello, Mr. God, how are you today?" And the god would say, "I'm doing pretty good, Mr. Pharaoh, how are you doing today?" It's that very stiff, stylized presentation that we recognize as Egyptian. Because Egyptian art pretty much looks the same. Why do you recognize it as Egyptian? Because it looks like all the other Egyptian stuff you've seen. It has that Egyptian quality to it. Some of you will remember, although the longer I teach, the fewer of you do, which is depressing. 1987, on the Virgin record label, the hit group The Bangles and their #1 single, Walk Like an Egyptian. Lead singer is Susanna Hoff, down in the bottom right there. Lead guitar is Jane Wiedlin, who is not being portrayed there. If you don't quite remember the song, then you've at least seen the video on VH1 Oldies, which is even more depressing. But go ahead and laugh. It'll happen to you someday. You'll be channel surfing and you'll see a video and say, "That's a cool song," and look over in the bottom corner. "What's that doing on VH1 Oldies?" "Oh no, that song is old. What does that imply about me?" Change the channel fast. Anyway, you've probably seen the video, at least on VH1 Oldies, and you know how the video works. You can get the joke. You know why the song is kind of a fun party song. You get the joke. Because how do you walk like an Egyptian? Like this. Well, did the Egyptians walk around like that? Well, no. But that's what imitates the stiff, stylized presentation we find in ancient Egypt. Things don't change very much over time. Paintings all kind of look the same. They have the same kind of quality. I can make this point even more dramatically to you if we look at some Egyptian sculpture. If you go, for example, to page 8 in your textbook, at the top left of the page you have a different photograph in your textbook of this sculpture of an Egyptian pharaoh. Don't be too technical here. Just take a look at the body posture, the posture of the body here. The eyes straight ahead, the head locked back, the shoulders squared, the back straight, the hands at the side. Take a look right next to it across this page there, the right-hand side of page 8, figure 214. And yet another pharaoh, and yet the body posture is the same. The eyes straight ahead, the head locked back, shoulders squared, back straight, hands at the side. This is the same posture. Take a look at the bottom of that page, figure 215, the bottom of page 8. The Temple of Ramses, it's an incredible architectural accomplishment. The bodies here are 60 feet tall, sitting down. That's a 6-story building sitting down. That's how tall these structures are, these sculptures are. It's quite an impressive accomplishment. And this photograph, which I believe is a different one than what you have in your textbook, there's a man standing here in the doorway. He strikes me as a tall man, and that's his height there. Was an incredible accomplishment. I'm not taking anything away from the accomplishment when I simply point out that the posture is the same. The eyes straight ahead, the head locked back, the shoulders squared, the back straight, the hands at the side. The sculptures all pretty much look the same. Now, experts can pick out technical differences, but for people like you and me, they all look pretty much the same. And now I can make this point even more dramatic to you. If you go back to that first sculpture we looked at the top of the page, figure 213 at the top of the page, check out the date in the caption, circa 2550 BC. The C before the date, the letter C before the date, stands for the Latin word circa, which means around, like a circle is round. Around 2550 BC. Check out the date for the other sculpture up there. That's roughly 1850 BC. That's 700 years later. 700 years later. Check out the date for the Temple of Ramses at the bottom of the page, figure 15, figure 215. The date here, roughly 1250 BC. That's 1,300 years later. What we've just done in a minute and a half or so is look at the development and change of Egyptian sculpture over 1,300 years. 1,300 years, that's a long time. And in 1,300 years, what's changed besides the hat styles? You can expect hat styles to change, but what doesn't change is what a sculpture looks like. If you tell somebody, I'm going to go home and make a sculpture, they say, I know what it's going to look like. Eyes straight ahead, head locked back, shoulders squared, back straight, hands to the side. Because that's what sculptures look like. The idea of a sculpture and what it looks like doesn't change. Things stay stable for a very long time in ancient Egypt. With one exception. For only a brief time, only a generation, Egyptian art changes very dramatically and very radically. And now I'd like you to turn to page 10 in your textbooks. At the top of that page, figure 220, you have the bust of Queen Nefertiti, a different photograph in your textbook. And you don't need to know lots of artsy-fartsy words to know about sculpture to know that this is just different from what we've been looking at. It's different. It has a different quality to it. At the bottom of that page, figure 221, you have some wall carving, which we can compare to that earlier traditional wall painting, which is a lot more fluid, a lot less stiff. It's not quite that stiff, stylized presentation we saw earlier. I mean, it still has an Egyptian quality to it, but it's a lot more relaxed. Here you have a husband and a wife and 3 children in kind of a living room setting there. It's just different. That painting at the top of the painting, the painting at the top of that page, figure 219, remarkably different from that traditional pharaoh and the god painting we saw earlier. For a brief period of time, Egyptian art changes very radically. And just like everything else in the world, there's a story about this change in this time period. It's a story which touches tangentially on the life of the woman you see at the top of page 10 in your textbook, Queen Nefertiti, more directly on her husband, the Pharaoh of Egypt. And I'm going to tell you his story. It's the story of Nefertiti's husband, who, by the way, is the father in the wall carving that we look at here at the bottom of page 10. At the start of the story, his name is Amenhotep, and I'm going to be telling you his story in a few minutes. Amenhotep, the Pharaoh of Egypt. I spelled that word out for you. I know you've run across the word before, but it's spelled kind of awkwardly in English. He's the dictator of Egypt. But before I can tell you his story, we need to talk a little bit about Egyptian religion. We can describe Egyptian religion as an example, yet another example of polytheism, a religious system we find examples of all over the world. We talked about Sumerian polytheism in an earlier session, and if we started off diagramming Egyptian religion, we'd start off with our diagram of people down here in this physical universe that you and I live in, that we taste, touch, see, smell, and hear, that we experience with our 5 senses, that we interact with bodily, materially, this physical universe you and I live in. Up above this physical universe, in some kind of spiritual environment hovering around up there somewhere, are the gods. And our diagram looks very similar to Sumerian religion because practically Sumerian and Egyptian religions are identical. What I mean when I say they're practically identical is that in practice they work the same way. Now, of course, you have different gods in Egypt than you have in Sumer. You wouldn't expect to have the same gods in different places now, would you? Of course, you have to have different gods. You have different stories about the gods, and they have different attributes and so on, but the way the religion works is the same. In other words, if you grew up in ancient Sumer and you moved to ancient Egypt, then you would quickly find out, just like you would expect, that they have different gods down there, but the way the religion worked would be the same, would be practically identical. In practice, there wouldn't be very many differences at all. In fact, for us in this course, a freshman level introductory lecture series, there's really only one difference which is worth pointing out, and that is that every generation, one human being, when that human being dies, gets promoted and becomes one of the gods. And of course, you don't have to think too hard about who that is. That's the Pharaoh. It's one more reason to obey the Pharaoh. Not only is he the dictator who controls your water supply, but if you don't do what he says, he's going to come back and be mean to you after he dies. You know, technically it is a bit more complicated than that. Okay. When the Pharaoh dies, he has to appear before a panel of judges and prove that he's good enough to become one of the gods. I guess it's like Egyptian Idol or something like that. But it's all a game. Okay, it's all rigged, kind of like American Idol. If you're in the Pharaoh club, you're gonna end up in the God club. Okay, you had to jump through some hoops, but It's pretty much fixed. Well, that's the background that you need to understand the story of Amenhotep, the husband of Queen Nefertiti, and I'm going to tell you his story.